How do you prepare young men for a war that has long become hell? How does a volunteer program work that lures soldiers for trench warfare in Ukraine with money? And what happens to those who sign up?
In Crisis Mode, the podcast from Conflict Zones with Jan Jessen.
Hello to a new episode of the Crisis Mode. My name is Jan Jessen. I am the political editor of the NRZ and have been a reporter for the Funke Media Group in crisis regions for many years. Today, I am taking you to a training camp in eastern Ukraine. We arrived there. It's a place that cannot be precisely named. There are reasons for this, as these training centers or training sites, these are also targets for the Russians. The day before we arrived at this training center in eastern Ukraine, there was an attack near Sumy at the border with Russia. 6 recruits lost their lives there. Now, just a few days ago, so a few days before this recording, there was another attack on a training center. 12 recruits or 12 soldiers died. So these training centers are also targets for the Russian air forces, and therefore the exact name or location of this training camp must not be disclosed. And this was definitely a kind of dip, surrounded by a hilly, wooded landscape, and they had set up an obstacle course there where the soldiers trained. It was a training ground of the 28th Brigade, which I have visited several times. And on the day we were there, exactly 30 young men between 18 and 24 years been on site and trained there for their first frontline deployment. These were all young men who volunteered, drawn in by a new recruitment program. You might know that there are massive recruitment problems in Ukraine. So the brigades that are at the front are now very thinned out in terms of personnel. The losses are just immense, both those who fall or are so severely injured that they can no longer fight. And it is relatively difficult for Ukraine, difficult to find volunteers, even for normal mobilization. Normally, men above 25 years old are obliged or can be drafted into the Ukrainian army, but this is also challenging. Many avoid military service, the number of deserters is increasing. We discussed this in another episode before, discussed in our podcast. We're putting it in the show notes for you. So now there are somehow attempts to make military service attractive, and for that, a volunteer program was launched at the beginning of this year. This promises those who commit for a year, among other things, a salary of 22,000 euros. That is equivalent to 22,000 euros per year. Sounds like little at first, but in a country where the average annual income is 5,000, it is quite attractive for some young men. And so the people we met at this training facility, these recruits came into the program. And the question is also, what does training actually mean? And how can you learn what happens at the front? The reports, the videos we have from the front are just extreme, just brutal. It's really a massacre that's happening up there now, also due to drone activities, which are simply immense, making the battlefield more transparent than ever before. And it's just ultra dangerous now. And these young recruits already had 4 weeks of training under their belt. And today they were supposed to have a very special training, a course where they would be pushed to their physical or psychological limits. And one of the instructors, Mykola, explained this to us, older soldier who was the head of these trainers. And he explained what mattered to them on that day.
It's primarily about psychological training. We want to turn these men into warriors. They learn how to handle weapons, armor, and stress, and they should take these skills with them to the front lines.
What we saw there was really training under real operational conditions, one could say. The instructors were shooting with live ammunition, so we actually had to put on our protective vests and helmets when we were on the site, because bullets were just flying around. You could sometimes hear the whistling of the bullets as they flew past, and it was really like you imagine a little bit in those American films like Full Metal Jacket, for example. So the instructors are shouting at these young people as they crawl through the barbed wire. They're shooting right next to them, so the ground splatters when the bullets hit. It was quite intense. And I, of course, talked to the young people there on site and asked what motivates them. One of them is Andrei, who is 21, comes from an oblast, a region in the west of the country, and he wants to go to the front later as a medic.
They said it's your decision. You can leave whenever you want. Half of my money went to my family, the other half to friends. That was important to me.
The first payment he mentions is about 4,500 euros. They receive it immediately, as soon as they sign the contract. And yes, as I said, Andrei tells him that he gave part of it to his family and also to his buddies, who were certainly pleased about it. But as I said, he also has 4,300 euros, which is almost a year's salary, an average yearly salary in Ukraine, so a very, very large amount of money for Ukrainian standards. And by the way, because Andrei has said he wants to become a paramedic, the guys who volunteer for that are all deployed in the infantry. So if you sign up for this volunteer program, if you sign there, you will join the infantry, and you can then decide if you want to be a medic, sniper, or join an assault unit. But otherwise, you're in the infantry, and the infantry is currently the most dangerous thing you can do. There are front sections where over half of the people who go forward, who are deployed forward, do not return unscathed, meaning they are either dead or at least seriously injured afterward. And yes, it is simply a really brutal situation currently at the front. Others have not even told their parents, like a 20-year-old recruit from the Kiev region who didn't want to give me his name, but he signed up completely on his own, without talking to his parents.
I didn't tell my mother I was leaving until a week later.
One can imagine that a mother might not be particularly thrilled when she hears from her son that, yes, he is now at the front, or being prepared for the front. And in this respect, yes, I was also somewhat torn when he told me this. I do think that one should somehow sort it out with their family, but the guys are grown up, they are of age, and thus they can do what they want. For many, money is indeed a decisive factor for this decision to join the army, as they have openly communicated to us, but not solely. Stanislaw, for example, in his early 20s, from the Dnipro region, says he sees it as an opportunity.
I hardly told anyone, maybe a friend, and he just said, "You're an idiot." It's a good opportunity. I get an education, even paid for my studies, and of course, I want to defend my country.
For the Ukrainian leadership, this program is naturally a risky balancing act. On the one hand, young men are supposed to be lured with money to replenish the exhausted, depleted brigades. That is important. As I said, I already mentioned, there are recruitment problems, enormous recruitment problems in Ukraine. There is resistance in some places against the sometimes quite robust manner in which recruitment officers take people from the street and then essentially conscript them. There have already been several attacks on recruitment officers. There have even been assassination attempts against recruitment officers. So there are now many, many reservations. The number of volunteers has significantly decreased. At the beginning, when the Russian invasion began in February 2022, thousands, tens of thousands of people volunteered to fight. Many of them are now dead or so severely wounded that they can no longer fight. Yes, and somehow ways must be found to maintain the combat capability of the Ukrainian army. And so with this volunteer program, on the other hand, one must also say, of course, that it can cause resentment. So on one side, there are those already in the army who say, well, why are these new recruits getting such great conditions? And we have been conscripted, have been here at least 3 years, probably longer, get a worse salary, and do not have these incentives that these young people have. This causes irritation, discontent within the ranks of the army in some places. And of course, it could also cause problems in society if many of these 18 to 24-year-olds should die or be injured, then possibly mothers would always be on the streets, rebelling. So it is a balancing act that the government is currently performing. How it will turn out, nobody knows. There was, for example, a joke circulating in the camp. One person said, we are We are worth 1 million up until the first grenade. Why 1 million? Because the salary is 1 million hryvnias, which is the Ukrainian currency, roughly equivalent to 22,000 euros. The motivations of these young recruits, as I have already mentioned, range from, on one side, patriotic idealism, and on the other side, this story, okay, I have the opportunity now to earn a lot of money within a year and to receive these benefits. And at the same time, for one or the other, it will also be a kind of test of courage. Like, right, I can tell my friends I'm fighting for Ukraine. So also many of these brigades advertise in a very, how should I say, kind of a TikTok style for new recruits. So there are very many billboards you see in Ukraine with images of soldiers confronting some zombies and orcs, or ride on cats over some zombie army. So it's very much, how should I say, an appeal that, of course, is aimed especially at very young people. Aims. And possibly that is also a reason why people decide, because they don't want to appear as cowards. And I think there are many things that play again. Role. The training, in any case, is extremely tough, right? So the guys we saw there have already been in training for 4 weeks and have learned quite a bit. And as I mentioned earlier, and as you heard in the sound snippets, they really train hard. So they are in full gear with a backpack, a gas mask, a rifle, with everything that one would have in the field, with a bulletproof vest as well. They were chased through this course. It's a course you can imagine, like, you know, from movies, with various obstacles, with trench systems where they have to jump in, where they then run through the trench system as if they were storming a trench occupied by Russians. The recruits have also, at least partially, operated with live ammunition. And then they go into bunkers where some smoke grenades have been thrown. Landmines explode infernally loud. Hand grenades are thrown to put the recruits under massive psychological stress. And of course, it is also extremely physically exhausting. So the guys were really worn out by the time they reached the end of this course.
Основною метою цих тренувань – це вивести воїна з рівноваги, щоб показати йому масовану атаку, допустим, ворога, щоб побачити, як він...
The goal of such exercises is to unbalance the fighter. We simulate a mass enemy attack and want to see if they will complete their mission or collapse. Will they act or crawl into a hole? Today proved that we are well prepared. Everyone completed the parkour. No one dropped out.
Зброєю, бронею. Ніхто не вийшов з дистанції, всі її виконали на відмінно.
This is Mykola again, the instructor who already said something about what they plan to do here. He also gave me a quote, which I found a bit borderline. He says, we forge steel from rifle fire. That, well, maybe you just have to leave it at that. But then, of course, the whole rhetoric is naturally very martial in such a situation. When there's talk of warriors, fighters, and who knows what else. Yes, but of course, this ground warfare that we looked at, or the infantry, is of course only a part. Right now, the Ukrainians are having massive problems. I said so, recruitment problems on one side. On the other side, the Russians have been advancing further in recent weeks. The summer offensive has evidently begun now, especially in the Donbass, in the area of Kostiantynivka, Kramatorsk, Slovyansk, and also up north near Sumy. There are apparently also attacks, or increasingly intense attacks by the Russians. And at the same time, it must be said, the Ukrainians have certainly moved forward significantly. There was, over the weekend before we recorded this podcast, an unprecedented attack. You've probably heard about it. Nothing like this has ever happened in military history by the Ukrainian intelligence service on Russian airfields, and indeed in Russia itself, deep in Russia, in Siberia, thousands of kilometers away from the front, where the Ukrainian intelligence somehow managed to smuggle drones into Russia, to Siberia partly, to Murmansk, far in the north, near the Arctic, and in the drones were hidden in trucks, and the roofs of the trucks, which were then parked near the airfields, the roofs opened via remote control, and the drones flew out and these strategic bomber fleet of the Russians attacked. That was a completely insane action. We might also come back to that in one of the other episodes on how something like that works and the huge logistical effort behind it. So Ukraine keeps pushing back its limited options, trying again and again to set up, to try out new things, at least in the negotiations that have now started here in Istanbul at the time of recording this podcast, is currently the second round of negotiations took place to at least put themselves in a position in these negotiations, which is not entirely weak. So in negotiations, it's simply important to be in a strong negotiating position, to force the opponent to make compromises. Currently, it is still really difficult, one must say. So the positions are very, very, very far apart. It doesn't look like it will be resolved within the next weeks or months because the United States is also unavailable as a mediator. As mentioned, it is a bit difficult at the moment. But back to the training camp. So a recruit who particularly stood out was Daniel. He also just looked like a, very young man, like a very boyish face with a little peach fuzz, and he was very talkative. The others possibly didn't talk as much because they were exhausted from the running, but he expressed himself very, very decisively. He comes from Kryvyi Rih, which is the hometown of Zelensky, and his radio call sign is historian. Soldiers always have radio call signs. They are not their real names. Essentially, everyone can choose their fighter name, their radio call sign. And he told me that he has been interested in military history since he was a child. His father's death influenced him. And he also told his mother when the Russians invaded Ukraine, I will join the military someday. He was 15 then.
There are no people who aren't afraid. People who aren't afraid don't live. Do I think about what the future will hold? But very cautiously. Why? Because I understand that when I think about that, everyone is afraid. Anyone who isn't afraid isn't alive. I don't often think about what awaits me at the front. Otherwise, it would break me. Sometimes I imagine myself lying in the trench when it's raining or when we're attacked. I try to be prepared, even if I'm never 100% successful. But that's why I'm here. That's why I train.
In conversation, Daniel seems very clear and composed. And as mentioned, it was really important to him to speak with us. And he also knows that the training is, of course, just the beginning.
There are no people who aren't afraid. People who aren't afraid don't live, I think. This is just a drop in the ocean. I know we have a long way to go in training to defeat those who attacked our country. This is the will to survive. We don't do this for fun. We do this to survive.
I hope that he comes out of it clean. I hope that all the guys come out of it clean. They're simply young men who, when they finish their training, that is, after leaving this training ground, they still have another 4 weeks training ahead, where they are also specialized. And after that, they head to the front and into hell, or there is no other way to describe it. What is happening at the front is the hell. All the reports you see, all the reports you hear, also from soldiers, say that it is just extreme. So I also spoke with someone on the last trip who told me he was deployed at the frontline section between Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk in the east of Ukraine, in the southeast. He says that now, when you go forward, right to the front, to the zero line, and lie in provisional holes that you have to dig yourself, that then Russian drones, sometimes from such holes where 2 soldiers are lying, up to 150 drones dropping grenades. It's just total madness. So what's happening up there must really, really be crazy. And in that sense, yes, these young people are just being sent into hell. And that might be something they can't really prepare for, no matter how tough the training is. That's how the war continues. Now, in the 4th year, nearly 3.5 years, Russia has been waging war in Ukraine against Ukraine. For almost 3.5 years, Russia has been bombing Ukrainian cities and critical infrastructure. And for almost 3.5 years, young people have been dying at the front for a war which Putin instigated and which hopefully will soon be resolved at the negotiation level. Whether and when this will happen, that is the big question. Maybe Stanislav and Daniel and others will be lucky that this war ends quickly and they don't have to fill the whole year and fight. But the outlook seems somehow, as I just said, to be rather difficult on a diplomatic level. The war simply continues unexpectedly. Russia has so far rejected offers or demands for a ceasefire. Ceasefires that were proclaimed have been continuously broken. Civilians keep dying. For example, during attacks on Zaporizhzhia, the region, or also in other areas, including children. Moscow also talks about the Ukrainian side is now increasingly reaching the Russian hinterland. These attacks on the airports are currently being mentioned, but there are also repeated acts of sabotage. Bridges are being blown up in Russia itself, so the war is rather expanding than being contained. The hope for peace is definitely not particularly strong at the moment. This podcast was produced by Alexander Baumeister, also a journalist at the radio station of the Funke Media Group. You can find all episodes of Krisenmodus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. If you want to follow us, feel free, and we will of course answer your questions or feedback as well. Write to us at krisenmodus@funkemedien.de. There are definitely new episodes every second Wednesday. Occasionally, we also produce special episodes on current events. Those who know us are aware of that. If you don't want to miss these special episodes, then subscribe to us. Or you'll definitely be informed when we produce something current. Thank you for listening. Stay with us, feel free to recommend us, and stay safe. Take care. All the best.
In Crisis Mode, the podcast from Conflict Zones with Jan Jessen.